The evening air in Caracas was tense as President Nicolás Maduro appeared on state television, his tone unyielding, his words deliberate. Behind him, the Venezuelan flag stood tall, its colours vivid against the solemn setting of the Miraflores Palace. The announcement that followed would ripple far beyond Venezuela's borders. He declared in a firm voice, "I have approved the precautionary measure of immediately suspending all effects of the energy agreement and everything agreed upon in this matter. It is a precautionary measure that I have the authority to take as president, and I have approved and signed it. Everything is suspended." With that statement, President Maduro abruptly halted one of the most strategically sensitive energy accords in the Caribbean, an agreement that had linked Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago in a delicate balance of gas development, regional diplomacy, and shared economic interest. The reason, he said, was not a technical issue or a trade dispute, but something far deeper, a perceived act of provocation. Trinidad and Tobago, a small island nation just miles off Venezuela's northeastern coast, had welcomed a visiting US Navy warship. For Caracas, that gesture was unacceptable. In the same address, Maduro accused Trinidadian Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar of crossing a red line. "We have maintained this energy agreement," he said, his voice rising with emphasis, "but given the Prime Minister's threat to turn Trinidad and Tobago into an aircraft carrier of the American empire against Venezuela and South America, we are left with only one alternative." That alternative was suspension, an immediate freeze of all cooperative projects under the bilateral gas accord, including joint exploration in the Dragon gas field, which had long been touted as a symbol of regional cooperation. For years, Venezuela and Trinidad had worked together on this venture, navigating complex US sanctions, export permits, and multilateral approvals. The deal had allowed Trinidad to process Venezuelan natural gas through its Atlantic LNG facilities, offering Caracas a way to monetize its resources despite international restrictions. Now, with a single order, that pathway was shut. The announcement landed like a diplomatic thunderclap across the Caribbean. Analysts quickly noted that the decision was not merely economic, it was deeply political, reflecting the sharp tensions between Washington and Caracas that continue to define Venezuela's foreign policy. In recent months, relations between the United States and Venezuela had fluctuated between cautious engagement and renewed hostility. Washington had eased some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector earlier in the year, but talks over electoral conditions and human rights had stalled. Maduro's move now signaled that Caracas was hardening its stance again. The presence of a US warship in Port of Spain was, from Trinidad's perspective, routine, part of joint maritime cooperation on counter-narcotics and regional security. But in Venezuela, it was viewed through an entirely different lens. Maduro and his advisors saw it as a direct military gesture by the United States in their near waters, one that undermined sovereignty and threatened what Caracas calls the peaceful zone of Latin America. State media in Venezuela framed the event as a provocation disguised as partnership, replaying footage of the American vessel docking in Trinidadian ports, accompanied by local officials. The imagery was used to reinforce the government's message that US military presence in the Caribbean was not an act of goodwill, but part of a larger plan to encircle Venezuela politically and militarily. As the broadcast continued, Maduro accused Washington of using small nations as instruments of pressure. "They have turned our neighbors into staging grounds," he said, "but Venezuela will not bow to threats." The suspension of the gas accord also touched on a broader narrative, one Maduro has maintained for years, that Venezuela is under siege by imperial forces. The rhetoric, though familiar, found renewed intensity in this context. With global attention focused on oil markets and energy realignments, Caracas framed its decision as both an act of defiance and defense. Inside Venezuela, the reaction was mixed. Supporters of the government cheered the decision as a patriotic stand against foreign meddling. Opposition figures, however, warned that it would further isolate the country economically. They pointed out that the gas deal had been one of the few remaining windows of international cooperation, providing much-needed revenue to a struggling state-owned energy sector. Economists estimated that suspending the deal could cost Venezuela tens of millions of dollars in lost potential exports each month, while Trinidad and Tobago could face delays in securing new gas supplies to feed its LNG plants, facilities that support a large part of its national economy. But for Maduro, the calculus appeared to go beyond economics. In his speech, he invoked historical grievances, referencing decades of US interventions in Latin America, from Panama to Grenada, from Cuba to Chile, and positioned Venezuela's decision as part of a long tradition of resistance. "We have seen this pattern before," he said. "They come with ships and promises, but their goal is always domination." International observers quickly reacted. Within hours, statements began to emerge from regional organizations and foreign ministries. The Caribbean community, CARICOM, urged restraint and dialogue, expressing hope that both nations could return to the negotiating table. In Washington, officials described Maduro's accusations as baseless and reaffirmed that the US naval visit to Trinidad was a routine security cooperation exercise. For Trinidad and Tobago, the diplomatic fallout posed a challenge. Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar, who had recently met with American naval officers to discuss maritime security and counter-trafficking operations, faced the delicate task of balancing regional alliances with national interests. In a press conference following Maduro's speech, she emphasized that Trinidad's cooperation with the United States is not directed at any neighboring nation and that her government remains committed to peace and constructive engagement. Still, the Venezuelan president's words carried political weight across Latin America. Maduro's government has often used foreign military movements as rallying points for domestic unity, portraying Venezuela as a target of external aggression. Analysts noted that the timing of his announcement, coming just weeks after fresh reports of US reconnaissance activity in the Caribbean, appeared calculated to reinforce that image. Meanwhile, within Venezuela's energy sector, the suspension raised practical concerns. The state-owned oil company, PDVSA, had been working closely with Trinidadian entities to develop cross-border gas pipelines and export frameworks. Those plans were now on hold indefinitely. Engineers and project managers described the order as a total freeze, not only halting physical work, but also stopping the flow of technical and financial data between the two nations. In the oil-rich coastal region of Sucre State, workers at the Dragon Field spoke of uncertainty. For many, the project had been a rare symbol of progress amid economic hardship. Now, machinery lay idle, and contracts were suspended pending further instruction from Caracas. Political analysts observed that Maduro's decision also fits into a broader pattern of Venezuela's foreign policy, one that seeks to reaffirm sovereignty through confrontation when under perceived threat. Over the years, Caracas has suspended or redefined multiple international agreements whenever tensions with the US or its allies escalated, from joint anti-narcotics programs to investment treaties. In this latest episode, the symbolism was unmistakable. By framing the suspension as a precautionary measure, Maduro was asserting his authority not just as head of state, but as protector of national dignity. The language he used, "It is a precautionary measure that I have the authority to take as president," underscored both the constitutional and emotional dimensions of his decision. Diplomats in neighboring countries quietly expressed concern that the standoff could expand. Venezuela and Trinidad share not only maritime borders, but also complex social and economic ties, including migration and trade. A prolonged freeze could affect shipping, fishing rights, and regional energy flows. For the United States, the incident represented a new point of friction in its Caribbean outreach strategy. Washington has sought to deepen partnerships with small island nations as part of its regional energy security initiatives, offering joint military and humanitarian programs. The arrival of a US warship in Trinidad was intended as a symbol of cooperation, but from Caracas, it was seen as a symbol of encroachment. Regional experts noted that this episode reveals the fine line Caribbean nations walk between engagement and alignment. For Trinidad and Tobago, maintaining defense cooperation with the US is standard practice. Yet for Venezuela, it becomes a geopolitical flashpoint. The proximity, barely 11 kilometers separating Venezuelan and Trinidadian waters, makes every gesture amplified. In the days following the suspension, Venezuelan state media doubled down on coverage, emphasizing sovereignty and regional independence. Commentators framed the issue as part of a wider confrontation between Latin American self-determination and US military projection. Government-aligned newspapers featured headlines like "Caracas defends its waters" and "Maduro draws the line." At the same time, diplomats from both sides were reportedly engaged in quiet, back-channel discussions, exploring ways to diffuse the crisis without public escalation. For Trinidad, the priority was to keep communication open. For Venezuela, it was to secure a public acknowledgement of respect for its sovereignty. Energy analysts warned that prolonged political uncertainty could deter future investment across the region. The gas fields straddling Venezuelan and Trinidadian territory represent one of the Caribbean's most promising untapped resources, holding billions of cubic feet of natural gas that could power industries and generate export revenue. The longer the suspension lasts, the more difficult it will be to revive confidence among international partners. Meanwhile, in Caracas, Maduro's address continued to dominate airwaves. His rhetoric, filled with nationalistic defiance, was replayed across television and radio. Crowds gathered in central plazas, waving flags and chanting slogans of solidarity. In the government's narrative, the suspension was not a setback, but a reaffirmation of independence. International reactions varied. While some Latin American governments avoided taking sides, others quietly signaled sympathy toward Venezuela's position, reflecting enduring skepticism of US influence in the region. Cuba, Bolivia, and Nicaragua expressed public support, praising Caracas for defending the dignity of Latin America. In contrast, European diplomats urged calm, with the EU's External Action Service calling for restraint and renewed dialogue on shared energy interests. Behind closed doors, energy companies expressed frustration that geopolitics had once again disrupted progress in the Caribbean's gas sector. For Venezuelans, however, the story was familiar. Decades of sanctions, diplomatic standoffs, and economic blockades have made confrontation with Washington almost routine in political life. What was new this time was the direct involvement of a neighboring Caribbean nation, a country that had long been seen as a friend, not a foe. As the sun set over Caracas the following evening, the streets echoed with mixed emotions. Some saw the suspension as a principled stand against imperial pressure. Others viewed it as another blow to a nation already struggling with inflation, shortages, and emigration. But regardless of opinion, few doubted that the move had reshaped Venezuela's regional dynamics once again. President Maduro, meanwhile, appeared resolute. In subsequent remarks, he doubled down, saying Venezuela would review all energy and security cooperation in the Caribbean region to ensure no further acts of aggression were tolerated. He called on other Latin American nations to reject what he described as military colonization by foreign powers. As diplomatic cables moved quietly between capitals, one thing became clear. The suspension was not merely an administrative act. It was a message, one sent across the Caribbean and beyond, that Venezuela, despite isolation and sanctions, still wields influence and intent. For now, the gas pipelines lie still, the agreements unsigned, and the waters between Venezuela and Trinidad calm but uneasy. Yet beneath the surface, a familiar current runs of power, pride, and the perpetual struggle over who truly commands the Caribbean's future. And as President Nicolás Maduro concluded that night's address, his voice carried both warning and conviction, a tone that has come to define his leadership. He looked into the camera and repeated with finality, "Everything is suspended.